Hello and welcome back for another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown to the top champions for ranked play for patch 1120. Even though this patch has had a lot of crazy changes added to it like Draconic buffs and a second Radiant Armory, not much has truly changed about the meta. For players that want to have a bit of fun, there's plenty of options like Draconic, while anyone still trying to climb has plenty of stable champions and compositions to choose from. All in all, it's been a good patch so far. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Kicking off our top 10, we have Lulu coming in as the number 10 champion. If there's one champion that is consistently overlooked and undervalued, it's Lulu. We're guilty of it too. Lulu just doesn't stand out as a champion outside of a few times where she's been clearly too strong. But Lulu has been a consistent part of late game compositions for quite a while, so it's time we acknowledge her impact on the meta. The question is, what does Lulu bring to a composition? Two things, both of which stem from her ability. Lulu's ability not only provides a form of CC, but it's also a buff to nearby allied champions. That buff is what's key here, as it's an 80% buff at level 2 for 5 seconds. Any carry champion is going to want that buff, though auto attack carries are certainly going to utilize it more effectively. But even AP champions can use the increased attack speed, as more auto attacks means more mana generated. As for the CC side of the ability, it's mostly useful at briefly stopping assassins that have jumped into the backline. In general, it's going to be useful since it's a 1.5 second stun, but an interesting aspect of the ability that is often overlooked is the fact that it also increases the enchanted champion's damage taken by 20%. Most of the time, this isn't likely to matter, but it can come into play with clever positioning of Lulu. And our final point as to why Lulu should be on your radar is that in the late game compositions, Teemo is a common addition to most boards. Guess what Lulu is? A Hellion. Having Hellion active increases the chances of Teemo activating Cruel at the end of a fight, often leading to round wins that would have otherwise been losses. Oh, and Lulu is a Mystic, so splashing her in isn't all that difficult. We're sorry for ignoring you, Lulu, but here's a spot in our top 10 as an apology. Next up, we have quite a few returning champions to our top 10 because, well, the meta hasn't really changed in quite a while. With that said, the champion coming in at number 9 is Nunu. As we said, not many changes stick around long enough to alter the meta. Most of the time it's the same composition, synergies, and champions doing well patch to patch because any outliers are often squashed in a B patch or in the next major update. That's not a bad thing as it does make for balanced metas, but it does mean the mid to late game ends up being a bit predictable, hence why our top 10 is full of familiar faces each patch. And one of those familiar faces is Nunu, a staple for the early game as a brawler and a linchpin to any abomination board for the mid game. Nunu has also had a bit of time in the sun as a pseudo carry with the Nunu composition, but let's be honest, that's a meme more than a real composition. Sure, it can be effective, but that's because Nunu 3 is a beast more so than the board being viable. The main reason for Nunu returning this week is Abomination, as they once again buff the synergy. Abomination still carries the AP torch, especially with Draconic being commonplace in the meta. Those two synergies naturally go hand in hand, and thus Nunu is played fairly frequently. So you've got the early game with Brawler, the mid game with Abomination, and the occasional late game thanks to Draconic, and the common denominator for all of that is Nunu. Moving along, we have Heimerdinger coming in at number 8. Heimerdinger has been absent from the meta for a bit because they nerfed the heck out of his mana pool. That meant a Heimer 1 was essentially a doorstep to your board, as the chances of it ever having a meaningful ultimate were near zero. Now that they've readjusted the mana pool to be less ridiculous, Heimerdinger is now once again a viable option in the ultra late game. Another reason for Heimerdinger's return to the meta is the Draconic buffs. Draconic is everywhere in the meta, so naturally that leads to mid and late games where Heimerdinger is being played. Maybe not as a main carry, but most Draconic boards have an end goal of playing a Heimerdinger too. It helps that 5 Draconic past level 7 often end up with a Heimerdinger popping out of eggs, making him a lot more common than he would be otherwise. Keep in mind that Heimer is still weak at level 1, especially without a Shojin or another form of mana generation like Invoker. Heimerdinger 2 is certainly strong, but not unbeatable. That said, a capped level 9 board generally utilizes Heimerdinger 2, and any player able to reach that stage of the game is more than likely to win. Another champion with a strong late game presence is Aphelios coming in at number 7. Of all the 4 cost carries in the meta, Aphelios boards have potentially the highest cap. This is because an Aphelios composition primarily consists of 4 and 5 cost champions like Volibear, Teemo, Akshan, Gwen, Diana, Rell, Ivern, and of course, Aphelios. That's not to say that Nightbringer boards aren't viable for Aphelios, just that the main reason to play late game Rangers is to utilize Aphelios with Akshan and a whole bunch of expensive units. There is a major downside to Aphelios, and that is his mana pool. Because it's so high, it means Aphelios needs at minimum a Rage Blade and ideally Invoker. Otherwise, the chances of him casting more than once a round are quite low, almost Heimerdinger 1 levels of low. The other downside, as we've alluded to, is the expense of the board. But all of those issues are solvable, making Aphelios a viable carry in the meta. Even better is the fact that the meta has slowed down so much as there's few compositions that spike in the early and mid game, plus so many Draconic players wanting to hit the late game. That naturally leads to a slower meta favoring Aphelios. Sure, he's not the best carry, but a late game Aphelios board will definitely be capable of finishing in the top 2. Next up, we're bumping up our duo to a trio with Ivern and Volibear and Fiddlesticks coming in jointly as the number 6 champion. Okay, we've already established in the past that Ivern and Volibear go hand in hand. But that's changed over time to now always include Fiddlesticks as all 3 Revenants are played together. It's rare to see one of these champions without the other regardless of the composition. Abomination does favor Fiddlesticks, but what's commonly added at level 8 and 9? Ivern and Volibear. The fact is, Revenants are the frontline synergy of set 5. Sure, they aren't always the best, and even in our top 10 we have other frontline champions ahead of them, but Revenants are always an option and have been the go-to standard since set 5 came out. Moving on down the line, we've got Lucian coming in as the number 5 champion. A reliable carry at last. Lucian is the definition of stable in a meta that is a bit all over the place thanks to the chaos of Draconic. If you need a consistent, viable meta build to play, then all you have to do is find a Lucian and slap in 6 Sentinels. Keep in mind that they did nerf Sentinels slightly, so it's not always quite as forgiving as it has been in previous patches, but it's still perfectly fine to play if your goal is the top 4. Lucian is for those players that want to climb ranked and keep playing the set as if the end isn't near. Lucian is for anyone that wants stability and chaos. Lucian is... okay, not boring, but he is simple and easy to play. And that's the legacy that Lucian will leave in set 5.5, as that's been the case ever since they added him and Sentinel. An easy but reliable composition that players can always turn to if their goal is the top 4. Just keep in mind that Lucian and Sentinels can struggle to scale well in the late game unless you're able to hit a Lucian 3. We're into our top 4, beginning with Gwen as the number 4 champion. Gwen is such an interesting champion because she is independently strong without items or synergies. Of course, items do help, but a Gwen 2 with no items can do a lot of work. Inanimate is always active, but let's be honest, it's kind of a fake synergy because it doesn't last that long. It's not bad, but because the area is small, doesn't move along with Gwen, and lasts a short amount of time, it's not really that effective. All in all, it's mostly just a slight boon to running Gwen. Mystic is far more impactful, though dependent on the lobby, as AD boards are generally more common. But Gwen can always be tossed into a late game board and find success with or without Mystic. We recommend trying out Gwen carry at least once before set 5 ends because oh boy, does she slap. Let's keep it moving with our next champion coming in number 3, Rell. We were a bit harsh on Rell in our last top 10 because yes, Rell hasn't been quite as good as she used to be, especially back in the day when it was basically just Rell and Revenants as frontline options. Nowadays we have more options like Galio and Knight, so Rell isn't the queen of the frontline anymore. But that doesn't mean that she's unplayable. Nay, we say to Rell being weak, as Rell is still one of the best frontliners in the game. And that's primarily because of Ironclad. Ironclad makes the lives of AD champions much harder and as such is a common splash trait for most mid to late game boards. Rell is the main Ironclad to use and as such always has a place in the meta. Plus, her ability is still amazing as it provides both a shield and an AoE stun. So we're putting Rell back where she belongs in the bottom half of our top 10. Of course, with that said, the champion coming in at number 2 is Galio. Sorry, Rell, but Galio is just, well, Galio. The fact that his taunt is huge, does AoE damage, and heals just adds so much value to any board, regardless of if that board is running Knights or Sentinel. The fact that Galio has both of those traits also increases value, whereas Rell is mostly just utilized for Ironclad. Galio has CC, damage, healing, a taunt, and 2 of the most common meta synergies. And he uses defensive items extremely well, which is perfect in 1120 with the addition of a second Radiant item. What more could you possibly want from a frontliner? And finally, we have our number 1 champion for patch 1120, Teemo. Once again, Teemo is the number 1 champion of the meta. There's not really any new reasons for this, the same ones we talked about last time are still true. Teemo's late game counter to any AD composition because his mushrooms slow the attack speed of enemies hit by 50%. On top of that, Cruel can win rounds that were otherwise going to be losses, which saves health, the most vital resource in the late game. Teemo also doesn't need to be the carry to do well, just having a Teemo is often enough, with or without items. That said, a Teemo 2 with full items is a beast and can carry your board into the late game. But the same issues are still there for Teemo, as 2-starring him can be difficult since he's both a 5-cost champion and cost health. Issues aside, no other champion really impacts the late game meta quite as much as Teemo does, so we're happy to once again crown him the #1 champion. That's all for our top 10 champions of patch 11.20. But before we go, we've got 2 honorable mentions to quickly talk about. Our first honorable mention is Diana. Assassins aren't doing all that well as a composition, but we want to highlight the impact Diana has on the mid to late game thanks to her ability. It may be difficult to find room in your composition for Diana, but it is certainly worth it if you need a way to disrupt the enemy backline. And with a second Radiant item being available, Diana can often be the perfect item holder for it, especially utility items like Shroud or disruptive items like Frozen Heart. And the other honorable mention is Vel'Koz. We want to acknowledge the Laser Squid because he does have a common place in the meta. The main issue with Vel'Koz is the prevalence of Draconic tends to push Vel'Koz out of the game. This is because Heimerdinger is the natural progression for a Draconic board, or the player is going for Ashe 3. Karma is also a common EP option, meaning Vel'Koz is just feeling a bit left out. It's still viable, and we do recommend using Vel'Koz, but if you're a Draconic player, chances are you're likely to forego the Squid for another champion like Heimerdinger or even Teemo. Alright folks, that's all we have for you for today. Overall, the meta hasn't changed all that much, with a lot of the same champions from the previous meta still holding down the fort in this one. The main difference being the inclusion of Draconic, which mostly just slows down the pace of the game, so late game champions are the key to success. Let us know in the comment section below what champions you've been having the most success with. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.